fearless, beautiful Lady Tames Ruthless billionaire CEO on their first passionate night, now he's obsessed forever. Hello my precious and cherished family, welcome back to our channel. Oh, how my heart sings with pure joy to welcome you to our sacred gathering, where love flows like a gentle river connecting all our souls. It's been a few days since we last shared a story together, and I've missed each and every one of you. How have you been? Has life treated you kindly? My thoughts have been with you, wondering about your joys and challenges. Your presence here today fills this space with warmth and meaning. Thank you for coming back to share this moment with me. Before we begin, let us briefly join our hearts in prayer. Beloved Creator of all things beautiful, we thank you for this blessed time you've brought us together to share another heartwarming story. As we begin, may your light shine upon each precious soul gathered here today. Guard their hearts from sorrow, shield their minds from worry, and comfort their spirits with peace that surpasses understanding. Bless each home represented here with love, joy, and abundance. As we share this story today, may it touch hearts, inspire hope, and remind us of the power of connection. And may your divine love flow through these words and bring healing to any wounded heart listening today. Amen. Oh, cherished family, my heart overflows with gratitude for each of you who sent your well wishes during my recent illness. Those who commented "Get well soon," and those who lifted me up in your prayers, Camelia Tucker, Patsy, and Francis, and a lot more which I can't mention. Know that I read all your comments and your kindness has carried me through these difficult days. I felt your support like a warm blanket around my shoulders when I needed it most. This is why I consider you not just viewers, but true family. That's also why I pour my whole heart into crafting these tales of love for you. Each story is woven with the same care and devotion you've shown me. When I sit down to write, I think of your faces, your comments, your lives, and I strive to create something worthy of the beautiful souls you are. Your steadfast presence in this community heals and inspires me daily. I am truly blessed to have each one of you in my life, and I never take that blessing for granted. In today's story, we'll explore how sometimes the most unexpected encounters can completely transform even the coldest hearts. We'll follow the journey of a man who built walls so high around his heart that no one could reach him until one fearless woman refused to be intimidated by his power. So, get ready because this tale might remind you of your own life-changing encounters. Before we begin this emotional journey, please take attendance by typing present in the comments so I'd know how many of you are here with me. Also share your birthday month. I have a special insight for each of you that I'll reveal later. Your participation makes these gatherings so much more meaningful. Also, if you haven't yet subscribed, this is your gentle invitation to join our family officially. There are so many more stories I've crafted specially for you, and I wouldn't want you to miss a single one. Now that you've done that, grab your favorite snack, perhaps a warm drink, and settle in as we begin this journey together. The morning sun cast long shadows across the polished marble floor of Barrett Enterprises' executive suite, its golden rays barely warming the Arctic atmosphere that surrounded Richard Barrett. At 32, he commanded an empire that stretched across continents, yet the victory felt hollow in the emptiness of his penthouse office. Richard Barrett had earned his nickname the Ice King through a decade of ruthless business decisions that left competitors shattered in his wake. His reputation preceded him in every boardroom from New York to Tokyo, a brilliant but merciless strategist who valued efficiency over emotion, results over relationships. Forbes had featured him 3 years running as one of America's most eligible bachelors, but those who worked closely with him knew better. There was nothing eligible about a man whose heart seemed encased in the same steel and glass as his skyscraper headquarters. His employees moved through the building with quiet precision, their voices dropping to whispers whenever he approached. They feared him not for any cruelty. Richard was too calculated for such base displays, but for his clinical detachment. He could terminate a 20-year veteran with the same emotionless tone he used to order his morning coffee: black, no sugar, like the suits he wore and the outlook he maintained. Barrett Enterprises dominated markets in 37 countries, with corporate offices in every major financial hub worldwide. The Barrett logo, a sleek, stylized mountain peak, adorned luxury hotels, tech campuses, and shipping vessels across the globe. His assets exceeded $14 billion, and his personal portfolio diversified across industries most people couldn't pronounce. Yet each night, Richard returned to an empty penthouse apartment that felt more like a museum than a home. Pristine white furniture remained untouched. Expensive art adorned walls that never heard laughter. The vast kitchen with its state-of-the-art appliances served only to heat occasional pre-prepared meals when he remembered to eat. No photographs graced his shelves, no mementos marked special occasions. His calendar contained business appointments, never birthdays or anniversaries. Holidays passed unacknowledged. The closest thing to companionship in his life was his executive assistant, whose relationship with him remained strictly professional, exactly as he preferred it. Standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows, 6 feet 4 inches, Richard watched the city below with steel-gray eyes that had earned him another nickname among those brave enough to whisper it, the Glacier. His tall frame cut an imposing silhouette against the morning light, broad shoulders perfectly aligned beneath custom Italian suits that cost more than most people's monthly rent. His dark hair, precisely cut and never out of place, showed the first hints of silver at the temples, lending him an air of distinguished authority beyond his years. His movements were deliberate, economical, like a predator conserving energy. When he spoke, his deep voice remained level, never raising to show anger or softening with warmth. His perfectly trimmed nails, clean-shaven face, and the subtle scent of an exclusive cologne completed the image of absolute control. His office mirrored this precision. 60 stories above Manhattan, the vast space contained only essentials, a glass desk unmarked by papers or personal items, a single ergonomic chair, and one longer seat for visitors he rarely welcomed. White walls displayed a single abstract painting, blue and gray shapes that resembled fractured ice. No plant softened the space, no color disrupted the monochrome palette of white, black, and steel gray. Only a few knew the truth behind Richard's frozen exterior. Born to wealthy parents who viewed children as accessories rather than treasures, young Richard learned early that emotions were weaknesses to be concealed. His father's constant criticism, "Barrett men don't cry, Barrett men don't need anyone," echoed in his mind even 25 years later. At boarding school by age 8, he'd written letters home that received no response. Holidays meant joining his parents at formal events where he was displayed like a trophy, then promptly forgotten. He'd constructed his first walls then, brick by emotional brick. Those walls had nearly crumbled once, 6 years ago, when Catherine entered his life with her warm smile and promises of forever. For 18 months, he believed her when she said she loved the man behind the reputation. He'd opened his vault of secrets, shared dreams he'd never voiced. Then came the discovery, her secret meetings with his chief competitor, the confidential files missing from his home office, the planned corporate takeover using his own private information. The night he confronted her, she'd laughed, actually laughed, at his pain. "Did you really think anyone could love a cold machine like you? I needed access, not romance." The final bricks in his wall were cemented that night. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Vanessa Chen, his executive assistant of 5 years, entered with practiced efficiency. Unlike others, she wasn't intimidated by his cold demeanor, though she maintained professional distance. "Mr. Barrett, your schedule for today is confirmed. The quarterly reports are ready for review, and I've prepared the notes for your 4 o'clock meeting with the Tokyo office." She paused, consulting her tablet. Also, the Children's Hospital Charity Gala begins at 8 this evening. Your tuxedo has been pressed, and the car will arrive at 7:30. Richard's jaw tightened. He'd forgotten about the gala, another evening of shallow conversations and forced smiles. "Is my attendance absolutely necessary?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "You're listed as a platinum donor, sir. The hospital board specifically requested your presence, and we've already confirmed." He nodded once. "Fine." 7:30. 3 hours later, Richard sat at the head of the conference table, surrounded by the Barrett Enterprises board of directors. The quarterly numbers had been reviewed, strategies discussed, and growth projections approved. Yet Marcus Donovan, the eldest board member and his father's former partner, cleared his throat as others were gathering their materials to leave. "Before we adjourn, there's one more matter to address. Our public relations department has compiled some concerning data." Marcus slid a folder across the polished table. "Your reputation in the market is affecting investor confidence." Richard didn't touch the folder. "The company's performance speaks for itself." "Numbers aren't everything, Richard," Victoria Winters, the marketing director, interjected. "The press has been calling you corporate America's heart surgeon, cutting out hearts without remorse." "That last acquisition," added Benjamin Hayes from the legal department, "the way those employees were dismissed, it's created backlash. Stock prices dipped 8% despite strong financials. The public sees you as," Marcus paused, searching for a diplomatic word, "excessively harsh. In today's market, perception matters. Consumers want to support companies with human values, not just profitable ones." Richard's expression remained unchanged. "And your proposed solution?" "Soften your public image," Victoria stated simply. "Beginning tonight at the gala." Richard stood, buttoning his suit jacket with one fluid motion. His expression betrayed nothing of his irritation. "I built this company by making necessary decisions, not popular ones. The market will adjust." His tone left no room for debate, though he noted the exchanged glances among board members. "However," he continued, "I understand the value of public perception. I'll attend tonight's charity function as planned." He gathered his papers, his mind already calculating the minimum time required to make an adequate appearance, arrive fashionably late, donate a suitably impressive check, shake the necessary hands, then depart before dessert was served. "I trust that satisfies your concerns," he added, not phrasing it as a question. "If there's nothing else." The board members remained silent. "Then we're adjourned." As the room cleared, Richard returned to his office, already dreading the evening of forced pleasantries and meaningless small talk that awaited him. Across town, in a modest community center nestled between aging brick buildings, Aria Mitchell knelt beside a small table where a 6-year-old boy carefully applied blue paint to paper. Her honey-brown eyes watched with patient attention as tiny hands worked with growing confidence. "That's beautiful, Jamie. Tell me about the blue circles," she said, her voice gentle but never condescending. At 27, Aria didn't match the typical image of a successful professional. Her curly hair was often gathered in a practical bun, her clothes chosen for comfort over style, her only consistent accessory being specks of paint on her fingertips. But in her field, art therapy for traumatized children, Aria was exceptional. With a master's degree earned through scholarships and stubborn determination, she developed techniques that reached children when traditional therapy failed. Hospital staff and social workers referred their most challenging cases to her, knowing her unique approach often succeeded where others couldn't. "Miss Aria, the blue is the ocean where my dad used to take me," Jamie whispered, the first personal detail he'd shared in weeks of sessions. Aria smiled, her heart lifting. These moments, these breakthroughs, were why she persisted despite the endless financial struggles and burnout that plagued her profession. Aria's one-bedroom apartment occupied the third floor of a pre-war building in Brooklyn. Unlike Richard's sterile penthouse, every inch of her space celebrated color and life. Sunlight streamed through gauzy curtains, dancing across walls covered with framed artwork from her young clients, bright handprints, hopeful rainbows, and fierce dragons that had once represented fears now conquered. Mismatched furniture told stories of flea market Saturdays and curbside rescues lovingly restored. Potted plants thrived on every windowsill, their green leaves reaching toward the light. Books filled shelves built from reclaimed wood, their spines revealing her passions, child psychology, art therapy techniques, and dog-eared poetry collections. The small kitchen featured open shelving displaying hand-painted mugs, each one holding memories of the children who had gifted them. Even her refrigerator door served as a gallery, magnets holding thank you notes and progress updates from parents whose children had found their voices through her work. The buzzing of her phone pulled Aria's attention from the stack of session notes she was reviewing. Her best friend Zoe's name flashed on the screen. "Please tell me you're not calling to ask about that gala again," Aria answered, already knowing the response. "Hello to you too, sunshine," Zoe laughed. "And yes, I am. The Children's Hospital Charity Gala is tonight, and I still need a +1. Zoe, you know I don't belong at fancy events with New York's elite. I'd stick out like paint on a wedding dress. That's precisely why you should come. These wealthy donors need to see the actual people doing the real work. Besides, the hospital funds your program, wouldn't it be good to show your face?" Aria sighed. "I don't have anything to wear. Or the right shoes. Or jewelry. Already solved. I'm bringing 3 options from the magazine's fashion closet. As beauty editor, I get certain privileges. The tickets cost more than my monthly rent," Aria protested. "My boss can't attend, so I have an extra. Come on, it's an open bar and gourmet food. When's the last time you ate something that wasn't microwaved?" Aria hesitated. "Will there be chocolate desserts?" "An entire table of them." "Fine. You win." After hanging up with Zoe, Aria's gaze drifted to the stack of bills on her kitchen counter. The red final notice stamp on her electric bill glared back at her, alongside the letter from her landlord informing her of the upcoming rent increase, a 30% jump she simply couldn't afford. 3 months behind on student loan payments, credit cards maxed out from purchasing art supplies her program couldn't fund, and now this. The math was unforgiving. Even working weekends at the coffee shop down the street wasn't enough to close the gap. Her phone dinged with a text notification from Dr. Abrams at Manhattan General, "Got a 9-year-old trauma case that needs your expertise. Budget's tight. Can you take it pro bono?" Without hesitation, Aria typed back, "Of course. Send details." She sank onto her worn couch, calculating how many extra coffee shop shifts she could pick up. Last week, the private practice across town had offered her a position treating wealthy children with minor adjustment issues, triple her current salary, comprehensive benefits, and regular hours. She had turned it down immediately. Those children had access to dozens of qualified therapists. Her kids, the ones who had witnessed violence, suffered abuse, endured loss, they had no one else who used her methods. The following afternoon, Aria sat cross-legged on the floor beside 8-year-old Lily, who hadn't spoken a word since witnessing a violent incident 3 months ago. Week after week, Aria had worked patiently, creating a safe space where speech wasn't required. "Today, we have something new," Aria said warmly, placing a large clay pot before them. "This pot broke, but we can fix it together." Lily's eyes widened at the shattered pieces. "Sometimes things break," Aria continued, her voice gentle. "But that doesn't mean they can't be beautiful again." They worked silently, applying gold-tinted adhesive to reconnect the fragments. When a piece slipped from Lily's small fingers and broke further, Aria nodded encouragingly. "That's okay. We'll use these smaller pieces to create something even more interesting." An hour passed. The restored pot now featured delicate gold seams where the breaks had been more beautiful for having been broken. Lily traced a golden line with her finger. "It's pretty now," she whispered, her first words in months. Aria's eyes filled with tears. She quickly blinked away. "Yes," she agreed softly. "It is." Later, when Lily's mother tearfully thanked her, offering to pay extra somehow, Aria simply shook her head. "Seeing Lily speak again is the only payment I need." Aria's understanding of struggle wasn't theoretical, it was woven into her earliest memories. Raised in a small apartment above the diner where her mother worked double shifts, Aria learned the value of hard work before she could write her name. Her mother, Aria Mitchell, had fled an abusive marriage with nothing but her 3-year-old daughter and an unwavering determination to create a better life. "We might not have much," Elena would tell Aria, "but we have our dignity and our courage. No one can take those unless you give them away." When 12-year-old Aria came home crying because wealthy classmates mocked her second-hand clothes, Elena sat her down at their kitchen table. "Listen to me," she'd said firmly. "A person's worth isn't in their wallet or their address. It's in how they treat others, especially those who can do nothing for them. Never bow your head to anyone just because they have money or power." Those lessons solidified when Elena developed cancer during Aria's senior year of high school. Despite mounting medical bills, Elena refused to compromise her treatment of others, sharing what little they had with neighbors in need. The night before Elena passed, she made Aria promise, "Use your gifts to help those who need it most. Their pain matters, no matter what society says." Hours before the gala, Aria stood before her bathroom mirror, barely recognizing herself. The emerald green dress Zoe had brought, a designer piece that normally cost more than 3 months of Aria's rent, transformed her usual practical appearance into something ethereal. The silk fabric flowed like water when she moved, catching light in ways that made her olive skin glow. "Stop fidgeting," Zoe instructed, securing another pin in Aria's upswept hair. "You look absolutely stunning." "I feel like I'm wearing someone else's life," Aria confessed. "What will I even talk about with these people? The struggles of art therapy budget cuts? The rising cost of watercolor paper?" Zoe squeezed her shoulder gently. "Just be yourself. Your passion is magnetic, Aria. Besides, these wealthy donors need to see the real impact of their checkbook charity." Aria nodded, though uncertainty still fluttered in her chest. Tonight, she would enter a world entirely different from her own. The grand ballroom of the Wellington Hotel gleamed under the light of crystal chandeliers, each prism scattering rainbows across cream-colored walls adorned with gold leaf detailing. Marble columns stretched toward the vaulted ceiling where Renaissance-inspired murals depicted scenes of healing and compassion, fitting for the Children's Hospital benefit. Round tables draped in white silk dotted the polished floor, each centerpiece a cascade of white roses and orchids arranged around miniature ice sculptures of the hospital's iconic facade. Silver trays bearing flutes of champagne and delicate hors d'oeuvres floated through the crowd on the hands of white-gloved servers. Women in designer gowns and men in precisely tailored tuxedos gathered in clusters, their laughter mingling with the soft music from the string quartet positioned near the grand staircase. The air carried the mingled scents of expensive perfumes, fresh flowers, and the subtle aroma of wealth, that indefinable fragrance of privilege and power. At precisely 8:45, late enough to make an entrance but not so late as to appear rude, Richard Barrett stepped through the ballroom's grand entrance. The effect was immediate and electric. Conversations faltered mid-sentence, glasses paused halfway to lips, and a subtle ripple moved through the crowd as heads turned toward the door. Like water parting before the bow of a ship, the guests created a path for him without seeming to move at all. No one dared meet his gaze directly, they nodded respectfully or pretended sudden interest in their drinks. The string quartet's melody seemed to fade beneath the weight of his presence. His expression revealed nothing as he surveyed the room with those steel-gray eyes. With calculated precision, he accepted a glass of champagne from a server who approached with noticeable hesitation. The message was clear: the Ice King had arrived, and the temperature in the opulent ballroom had dropped several degrees. Across the room, Aria stood with Zoe, feeling distinctly out of place among Manhattan's elite. She sipped her champagne slowly, knowing the bubbles went straight to her head. "That's Congresswoman Winters," Zoe whispered, nodding toward an elegant older woman. "And over there is, oh my God." Her voice dropped to an even quieter whisper. "That's Richard Barrett." Aria followed her gaze to the imposing figure by the entrance. "The notorious CEO? The one they call the Ice King," Zoe confirmed. "Worth billions and known for his cold-blooded business tactics. They say he's never lost a negotiation." Aria was about to respond when a waiter carrying a tray of appetizers backed into her, throwing her off balance. She stumbled forward, directly into the path of Richard Barrett, who had been making his calculated way through the crowd. Time seemed to slow as her champagne flute tilted, sending golden liquid in an elegant arc through the air. It landed with perfect precision across the front of Richard's immaculate white shirt and black jacket. A collective gasp rippled through the nearby guests. The music seemed to stop. Several onlookers took small steps backward, as if retreating from an impending explosion. Richard looked down at his ruined suit, then slowly raised his eyes to meet Aria's. In that frozen moment, instinct told Aria to cower, to stammer apologies, to shrink beneath the arctic intensity of his gaze. Everyone watching clearly expected her to dissolve into mortified tears. Instead, she straightened her spine, her mother's daughter to her core, and met his cold stare directly. Her eyes, warm honey to his steel gray, didn't waver. "I sincerely apologize, Mr. Barrett," she said, her voice clear and steady in the hushed silence. "Someone bumped into me, but the accident was still mine to avoid. I'd be happy to cover the cleaning costs for your suit." She extended a cocktail napkin toward him, not breaking eye contact. No excessive explanations. No trembling voice. No desperate pleas for forgiveness. Just a simple, dignified acknowledgement of responsibility, offered as one equal to another, despite the massive power imbalance apparent to everyone watching the exchange with bated breath. For the first time in years, Richard Barrett found himself momentarily speechless. He had expected fear, tears, or excessive fawning, the typical responses his presence evoked. This woman's composed directness caught him entirely off guard. She stood before him with neither trembling lip nor lowered gaze, offering a simple napkin as though they were merely strangers in a coffee shop rather than opponents in a deeply unbalanced power dynamic. Most striking was the authenticity in her eyes, no calculation, no hidden agenda, no performance. In his world of corporate masks and strategic interactions, genuine reactions had become so rare that he almost didn't recognize one. He felt the weight of 100 stares as the room held its collective breath, waiting for his response. The expected reaction would be cold dismissal or cutting remarks. Yet something about her steady gaze made those rehearsed responses feel suddenly inadequate. Richard accepted the napkin with measured movements. "A cleaning bill won't be necessary. I have others." "I'm sure you do," Aria replied, a hint of something unreadable in her voice. Richard raised an eyebrow. "You seem untroubled by this incident. Most people would be mortified to spill anything on a suit that costs more than the average monthly salary." "I'm certainly not pleased about it," she responded, "but I suspect we have different definitions of true mortification." "And what would yours be?" he asked, surprising himself with his curiosity. "Failing a child who needs help. Making choices that harm vulnerable people." Her eyes held his steadily. "The kind that don't wash away with dry cleaning." The subtle reference to his business practices wasn't lost on him. Few dared to even indirectly criticize him to his face. "You seem to have formed opinions about me without an introduction," Richard noted, his tone neutral. "Aria Mitchell," she offered simply, extending her hand. "And opinions form quickly in certain circles, Mr. Barrett. Though I generally prefer first-hand evidence over reputation." He took her hand, noting its warmth against his cool palm. "An unusual approach in New York." "Perhaps that's the problem," she replied, withdrawing her hand with quiet confidence. As she turned to rejoin her friend, Richard found himself in an unfamiliar state. Rather than the cold anger that typically followed any challenge to his authority, he felt something entirely different: curiosity. This woman, Aria Mitchell, had neither cowered nor flattered. She had acknowledged her mistake without excessive apology, met his gaze without flinching, and subtly questioned his character without fear of consequences. The entire interaction had lasted less than 2 minutes, yet it had disrupted the carefully maintained equilibrium of his world. He watched her move through the crowd, noting how differently she carried herself compared to the other women present. There was an authenticity to her movements, free from the calculated grace that filled these events. For the first time in recent memory, Richard felt the stirring of genuine interest in another person. Not for strategic advantage or business opportunity, but for the simple desire to understand someone who seemed immune to his carefully crafted intimidation. "My dear family, can you imagine standing up to someone known for destroying careers with a single word? Have you ever had such a moment where you surprised yourself with your courage? Those times when your heart was pounding, but something deeper than fear guided your actions. Share your story in the comments. I read every single one and find such inspiration in your experiences. And by the way, if you're enjoying the story so far, don't forget to like and hit that subscribe button if you've not done that yet. Your support means everything to me and helps our family continue growing together through these stories." An hour into the event, after mechanically engaging in expected conversations with hospital board members and fellow donors, Richard found his attention repeatedly drawn to the woman in the emerald dress. She moved through the crowd with natural grace, her laughter genuine when speaking with children from the hospital's art program who displayed their work. Unlike the calculated networking that defined these events, Aria Mitchell seemed to form real connections with everyone she encountered. Her conversations appeared meaningful rather than strategic. When she knelt to eye level with a shy child in a wheelchair, spending 5 full minutes discussing his artwork while politicians and celebrities waited nearby, Richard made his decision. He excused himself from a conversation with the hospital director and moved purposefully across the room. For the first time at any social function, he wasn't following a careful script of power plays and business opportunities. He was simply following his curiosity about a woman who seemed immune to the usual social hierarchies. "You're passionate about your work," Richard said, approaching Aria as she stood alone briefly by the dessert table. She looked up, surprise flickering across her features. "Mr. Barrett, I didn't expect further conversation after baptizing your suit with champagne." "Richard," he corrected, his tone softer than his usual clipped business voice. "And I'm curious about your work with the children." Their conversation moved naturally toward the terrace doors, away from the noise and performance of the main ballroom. Outside, the night air carried the scent of approaching rain, the city lights spread below them like fallen stars. "Art therapy isn't just drawing pictures," Aria explained, her face animated in the soft lighting. "It gives children a voice when words fail them." "And what about adults who've lost their voice?" Richard asked, surprising himself with the personal question. Aria studied him thoughtfully. "Everyone can heal if they're willing to be vulnerable enough to try." "Your company employs thousands," Aria noted, leaning against the stone balustrade. "What would you say is your purpose beyond profit?" Richard's automatic response about shareholder value died on his lips. No one asked him such direct questions. "Efficiency. Growth. Market dominance," he replied instead. "And do those things fulfill you?" she asked, her tone curious rather than judgmental. "They're measurable achievements." Aria smiled softly. "I make barely enough to cover rent. My achievements aren't measured in dollars but in moments, a traumatized child speaking again, a teen finding hope through creative expression." "Noble, but idealistic," Richard countered. "The world runs on capital, not good intentions." "Does it?" Aria challenged. "Or do we just tell ourselves that to justify choices that prioritize profit over people?" The question hung between them, uncomfortably direct. In his boardroom, such a challenge would be immediately shut down. Here, with city lights below and stars above, Richard found himself considering it seriously. "Tell me about your work," Richard said, genuinely wanting to understand rather than seeking information for leverage. As Aria spoke about art therapy techniques and breakthrough moments with her young clients, Richard realized he wasn't planning his next response or analyzing her words for weaknesses. He was simply listening. The sensation was foreign yet oddly compelling. Her voice, passionate and authentic, drew him in without performance or pretense. When she described using color theory to help children express emotions they couldn't name, he found himself nodding, engaged with her ideas rather than merely tolerating them. There was no strategy in his attention, no calculation of what he might gain. The board members' concerns about his image, the networking opportunities inside, the business calls awaiting his return, all faded to background noise as he focused on her words. For the first time in years, Richard was present in a conversation rather than merely participating in it. A heavy drop of rain landed on Aria's bare shoulder, followed quickly by another. Within seconds, the threatening clouds delivered on their promise as rain began to fall in earnest. "We should head inside," Richard said, glancing toward the ballroom. Aria pointed to a small door at the far end of the terrace. "That might be closer." They hurried across the now slick stone, reaching the door just as the gentle rain transformed into a downpour. Richard turned the handle, revealing a small sitting room, likely a private retreat for the hotel's distinguished guests. The space held just 2 armchairs, a small table, and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. A single lamp cast a warm glow over the intimate setting, the sound of rain against the windows creating a cocoon of privacy away from the gala's performative socializing. "Perfect timing," Aria said, brushing raindrops from her arms as Richard closed the door, shutting out the noise of the storm and the distant sounds of the party. The small room seemed to shrink further with each passing moment. Richard found himself noticing details about Aria that had escaped him in the ballroom's bright lights, the tiny scar near her left eyebrow, the calluses on her fingertips from working with art materials, the depth of compassion in her eyes when she spoke about her clients. She moved with a natural grace that came from comfort in her own skin rather than years of practiced poise. When she laughed at something he said, an honest response to a rare attempt at humor on his part, the sound was musical and unrehearsed. The physical attraction he had initially felt was transforming into something more complex, more unsettling. He was drawn not just to her beauty but to her authentic presence, her unguarded compassion, her willingness to challenge him without fear. For a man who had mastered control in all situations, this uncharted territory created a tension both uncomfortable and exhilarating. "There's this boy in my program," Aria said, settling into one of the armchairs. 8 years old, hasn't spoken a word since witnessing a violent incident in his home. Traditional therapy wasn't working, he would just sit there, silent, withdrawn. Richard sat opposite her, his usual impatience with personal stories notably absent. For weeks, he would only use black and red paint, dark, angry strokes. I just sat with him, creating alongside him without pressure to talk. Her voice softened. Then one day, I brought in a broken pottery piece. She traced an invisible line in the air. In Japanese art, there's a practice called kintsugi, repairing broken pottery with gold. The philosophy behind it is that breakage is part of an object's history, not something to hide. Richard found himself leaning forward, genuinely invested. We repaired it together, filling the cracks with gold paint. When we finished, he touched one of the gold lines and whispered, "It's pretty now." His first words in months. Her eyes glistened. He wasn't just talking about the pot. He was talking about himself, Richard said quietly. Aria nodded. Sometimes we need to see that our broken places can become the most beautiful parts of who we are. Something shifted in Richard's chest, an unfamiliar tightness that wasn't entirely unpleasant. "What about you, Richard?" Aria asked, turning the conversation toward him with genuine curiosity. "What broken pieces are behind the perfect facade?" The question was so unexpected, so devoid of the usual deference he received, that Richard almost laughed. In his world, no one dared probe beneath his carefully constructed surface. His wealth and power ensured that people wanted things from him, contracts, connections, funding, not the messy truth of his humanity. Yet here was this woman, who knew exactly who he was, showing not the slightest interest in what he could do for her career or her bank account. Instead, she looked at him with eyes that sought the person behind the power, the human beneath the empire. In that moment, the balance between them shifted. Despite his billions and influence, Richard suddenly felt like the vulnerable one, a sensation both terrifying and strangely freeing. The rain intensified outside, drumming against the windows like nature's own soundtrack to their unexpected encounter. What had begun as casual conversation evolved into something deeper, as minutes stretched into an hour, then 2. "I've never spoken this much at a charity event," Richard admitted, loosening his tie slightly. "Is that a complaint?" Aria asked, smiling. "An observation." He paused. "A favorable one." They discussed books they'd read, places they'd traveled, and perspectives on life that rarely emerged in their respective daily routines. The usual small talk of such events, market trends, property values, social connections, never materialized. Instead, they explored ideas about purpose, meaning, and the human condition with surprising synchronicity despite their different worlds. Their disagreements were as engaging as their points of connection, each challenge offered and received with genuine respect. The storm outside mirrored a subtle transformation occurring within Richard, turbulent, unexpected, and washing away long-established boundaries with surprising force. "You asked about broken pieces," Richard said after a moment of silence, his voice quieter than before. "My parents viewed children as accessories, not people to be loved." The words emerged before he could analyze or censor them, a rare occurrence for a man who measured every syllable. 8 years old, sent to boarding school. My letters home went unanswered. He looked at his hands. I built Barrett Enterprises from nothing because I learned early that achievement was the only currency that mattered. Aria listened without interruption, her expression free of the pity he despised. My ex-fiancée. Richard hesitated, surprised by his willingness to continue. She was working with my competitor. Used information I shared in private moments to orchestrate a takeover attempt. So you decided people couldn't be trusted, Aria concluded softly. I decided vulnerability was a liability, he corrected, meeting her gaze. Until tonight, I hadn't questioned that decision. Aria studied him for a long moment, her eyes reflecting compassion without judgment. Then, with simple grace, she reached across the small table between them and placed her hand gently over his. The touch was slight, just the warm weight of her fingers against his skin, yet the impact resonated through Richard like a shockwave. He couldn't remember the last time someone had touched him without agenda or expectation. Not a business handshake, not a calculated gesture, not a transaction of any kind. Just human connection, freely offered. He looked down at their hands, hers sun-kissed and marked with tiny paint stains, his pale and manicured to perfection. The contrast was striking, yet they fit together with unexpected harmony. We all build walls for protection, she said softly. But sometimes they keep out the very things we need most. Richard didn't pull away, an acknowledgement more revealing than any words he could offer. Tell me something no one else knows about Richard Barrett, Aria said, her hand still resting lightly on his, neither of them acknowledging yet neither pulling away. The question hung between them, charged with something beyond mere curiosity. I have a collection of first-edition classics hidden behind financial reports in my office, he admitted. I read poetry when everyone thinks I'm reviewing contracts. Her smile widened. The Ice King has a secret soft spot for literature. And you? He asked, the usual tactical nature of his questions replaced by genuine interest. What does Aria Mitchell hide from the world? I sing to myself when I paint, terribly off-key. Her laugh was soft, musical. And I've never told anyone how scared I am of failing the children who trust me. The honesty in her vulnerability matched his own, creating a balanced intimacy neither had anticipated. Their eyes held for a beat longer than necessary, the air between them charged with unspoken recognition of their growing connection. A sharp knock on the door broke the moment between them. The hotel manager appeared, looking apologetic. Excuse me, Mr. Barrett, miss. I'm afraid we're ending the gala early. The storm has caused flooding on several major roads, and we're advising guests to leave while it's still safe to travel. Richard checked his watch, surprised to discover nearly 3 hours had passed since they'd first stepped onto the terrace. "Thank you," he replied, his tone returning briefly to its usual authoritative cadence. As the manager left, Aria stood. "I should find Zoe. She's probably looking for me." "How are you getting home?" Richard asked, suddenly concerned about her safety. "The subway, I suppose. If it's still running." He shook his head. "Not in this weather." A moment's hesitation, then, "Let me drive you. My car is waiting downstairs." Aria tilted her head, considering him. "That's not necessary." "It's practical," he countered. "And," he added, his voice softening again, "I find I'm not ready for our conversation to end." The admission cost him something, a crack in his carefully maintained control. Yet watching her consider his offer, weighing her decision without fear or automatic compliance, made the vulnerability worthwhile. "All right," she finally agreed with a small smile. "Thank you." In the hotel lobby, they found Zoe anxiously checking her phone. "Aria, there you are. The trains are shutting down and she stopped short at the sight of Richard Barrett standing beside her friend. "Mr. Barrett has offered us a ride," Aria explained. Outside, Richard's sleek black car waited, his driver standing at attention despite the pouring rain. "James, you can go home to your family," Richard said, surprising his longtime driver. "I'll take the wheel tonight." "Sir? Are you certain?" The man looked genuinely concerned. "Completely. The roads will only worsen. Go home." After dropping a wide-eyed Zoe at her Upper East Side apartment, "Text me everything," she whispered urgently to Aria before exiting. Richard and Aria continued toward Brooklyn. The rhythmic sweep of wipers and the drumming rain created an intimate soundscape within the luxury vehicle. Richard drove with the same precision he applied to everything, yet his usual rigid composure had softened. "You drive your own car," Aria observed. "Surprised?" "A little. You don't seem the type to do anything yourself if someone could do it for you." Their eyes met briefly in the rearview mirror, electricity passing between them. "I'm discovering I might not be the type I thought I was," he replied softly. The rain had slowed to a gentle patter as Richard parked near Aria's building, a pre-war walk-up with weathered brick and wrought iron details. He insisted on walking her to her door, holding an umbrella over them both as they navigated puddles on the cracked sidewalk. At her third-floor landing, Aria paused with keys in hand. The night had taken them far beyond conventional boundaries, yet neither seemed willing to simply end it with a polite goodbye. "Would you like to come in for coffee?" she asked, her voice calm despite the weight of the invitation. "Just coffee," she added with gentle firmness. Richard studied her face, recognizing both the invitation and its limits. In his world, people rarely set boundaries with him. They either gave everything he wanted or nothing at all. "I'd like that," he replied simply. Heart quickening, Aria unlocked her door and stepped into her apartment, Richard following close behind. Stepping into Aria's apartment was like entering another world. Where his penthouse was monochromatic and pristine, her space overflowed with color and life. Mismatched furniture arranged for conversation rather than appearance. Bookshelves lined with well-read volumes, their spines creased with use. Plants thrived on every windowsill, reaching toward what would be morning light. But it was the art that truly captured his attention. Children's paintings and drawings covered her walls, not as decoration, but as treasures. Each piece displayed with the same care he'd seen given to million-dollar masterpieces in museums. "Sorry about the mess," she said, gathering sketchbooks from the couch. Richard shook his head slowly. "It's not messy. It's alive." The word felt foreign on his tongue. His own residence, with its untouched surfaces and perfect order, suddenly seemed less like sophisticated minimalism and more like a mausoleum, a place devoid of human touch or genuine expression. Steam rose from two mismatched mugs as they settled on opposite ends of Aria's worn but comfortable couch. Richard cradled his coffee, staring into the dark liquid as if it might contain answers to questions he'd never voiced. "When I was 10, he began slowly, I won a national mathematics competition. The prize included a ceremony where parents were invited to celebrate their children's achievements." He took a careful sip. "Do you know, I waited by the door for over 3 hours. They never came." "That must have been devastating for a child," Aria said softly. "What hurt most wasn't their absence, I was used to that. It was watching other parents beam with pride, seeing that connection I couldn't name but desperately wanted." He met her eyes. "That night, I decided if I couldn't earn their love through achievement, perhaps I didn't need love at all." His admission hung in the air between them, raw and unguarded. Aria set her mug down gently, considering her response. "Well, my mother raised me alone after leaving my father when I was 3. We struggled constantly, sometimes choosing between electricity and dinner." Her voice remained steady, without self-pity. "When I was 17, she was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer." Richard listened intently, noticing how she spoke with openness rather than guardedness about her pain. "During her final months, I was angry at the world. But she told me something I've never forgotten." Aria's eyes grew distant with memory. She said, "Pain can make you bitter or it can make you more compassionate. Choose compassion, it heals both ways." She smiled softly. "After she passed, I could have built walls like yours. Instead, I chose to use my understanding of suffering to help children process their own." "Wasn't that terrifying? Being so vulnerable?" Richard asked. "Terrifying, yes. But also freeing in ways I never expected." "But that approach doesn't work in business," Richard countered, leaning forward. "Vulnerability gets exploited. Compassion gets mistaken for weakness." "Does it have to?" Aria challenged. "Or is that just what we've been taught to believe?" Their conversation intensified, both fully engaged in a debate that transcended the usual surface-level exchanges that filled their respective worlds. "The market rewards strength and decisive action," Richard argued. "Not sentimentality." "I'm not talking about sentimentality," Aria responded, her eyes bright with conviction. "I'm talking about recognizing our shared humanity. Even in business, aren't you ultimately dealing with people? People with fears, hopes, families. People who would gladly take everything I've built if given the chance. Some would, yes. But by assuming everyone will, you miss connections with those who wouldn't." Her voice softened. "And what good is an empire if you're alone in it?" The question struck Richard like a physical blow. In defending his worldview, he found himself confronting its fundamental flaw, the emptiness it had created in his life. As they debated, the space between them on the couch gradually diminished, their bodies unconsciously shifting closer as their minds engaged. The intellectual sparring created a different kind of intimacy, one built on mutual respect and genuine exchange rather than superficial agreement. Their conversation reached a natural pause, words giving way to silence filled with unspoken understanding. In that moment of quiet, something shifted between them, the intellectual connection transforming into something more profound. Richard found himself looking at Aria not as an opponent in their philosophical debate, but as someone who had truly seen him, perhaps for the first time in his adult life. Not the billionaire CEO, not the ice king of Wall Street, but the man underneath those carefully constructed layers. "I've never met anyone like you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Aria's eyes met his, warm honey to cool steel. "Someone who argues with you? Someone who isn't afraid to see me as I am. Neither impressed by what I have nor intimidated by what I've built." The world outside her apartment, the storm, their different lives, the barriers of status and wealth seemed to fade into irrelevance. All that remained was this unexpected connection, this bridge between two souls who had begun the evening as strangers. When they leaned toward each other, it wasn't a calculated move or a momentary impulse. It was the natural conclusion to a conversation that had somehow reached beyond words. His lips finally met with hers, neither of them pulling back as it deepened. Their kiss felt like recognition, like finding something long forgotten, a memory of connection buried beneath years of solitude. As they finally drew apart to catch their breath, Richard felt a profound sense of disorientation. Throughout his adult life, every interaction had been filtered through his wealth, power, or reputation. People responded to what he represented, not who he was. But in Aria's eyes, he saw something different, acceptance without conditions, interest without agenda. She looked at him with a gaze that penetrated all his careful defenses, seeing past the empire to the man who had built it from his loneliness. The sensation was both terrifying and exhilarating. Like stepping off solid ground into air, not knowing if he would fall or fly. For a man who had controlled every aspect of his existence for decades, this surrender of masks felt like both a loss and a liberation. "What are you thinking?" she asked softly. "That I've spent my life being seen as Richard Barrett, CEO," he replied honestly. "Never just Richard." "I see you," she whispered. "Just you." His fingers traced the curve of her cheek with wonder, as though touching something precious and rare. The gentle rain against the windows created a soundtrack to their growing connection, the world outside fading further away with each passing moment. "Are you certain?" he asked, his voice carrying a vulnerability he'd never allowed himself to show. Aria's answer came not in words, but in the way she drew him closer, her hands warm against the cool fabric of his shirt. Their second kiss deepened with a tenderness that surprised them both. For Richard, each touch was a revelation, not of physical pleasure, though that was undeniable, but of emotional intimacy he had denied himself for so long. The walls he had built over decades began to crumble beneath the gentle force of genuine connection. As moonlight filtered through the curtains, casting silver patterns across her modest bedroom, they moved together in a dance of discovery. Each moment of closeness was accompanied by a deeper sharing of themselves, whispered truths, silent understandings, the language of two souls recognizing something essential in each other. What transpired between them transcended mere physical attraction. It was acknowledgement, acceptance, and the profound relief of being truly seen and embraced, not despite their differences, but with full awareness of them. In the quiet moments of connection, Richard experienced emotions he had long ago buried beneath layers of control and calculation. The carefully architected walls of his inner fortress, built brick by brick since childhood, began to fall away, not in a violent collapse, but in a gradual surrender. With each tender exchange, long-dormant parts of himself awakened. The boy who had waited for parents who never came. The young man who had trusted and been betrayed. The adult who had chosen power over connection because it seemed the safer path. These fragments of his true self emerged from shadow into light, no longer locked away but integrated into the man he was becoming in Aria's presence. The sensation was both terrifying and freeing, like a prisoner stepping into sunshine after years in darkness, blinded yet warmed by the same light. His mind, trained to analyze and strategize every situation, fell quiet for perhaps the first time in his adult life. In its place came simple presence, the ability to exist fully in this moment without planning the next or guarding against potential threats. For a man who had built an empire on control, this surrender should have felt like weakness. Instead, it felt like finding a strength he never knew existed, the courage to be vulnerable, to connect, to feel. As the first hints of dawn softened the darkness, they lay quietly together, the silence between them comfortable rather than empty. For Aria, the night had revealed unexpected depths in a man the world knew only as ruthless and cold. She had glimpsed the wounded child beneath the powerful exterior, seen the humanity he hid from others, perhaps even from himself. Her perspective had shifted from seeing him as merely a symbol of corporate greed to recognizing a complex human being capable of growth and genuine connection. The Ice King, she now understood, had frozen himself as protection, not by nature. For Richard, the transformation ran deeper still. The barriers he had maintained for decades, walls that had protected him but also isolated him, now lay in ruins around his heart. The vulnerability he had always equated with weakness had somehow become a doorway to something he had never experienced, authentic connection. In the soft light of early morning, they had each found something unexpected. Aria discovered that her capacity for compassion extended even to those society deemed undeserving. Richard discovered that beneath his carefully maintained control existed a man capable of feeling deeply, of being touched by another's spirit. Neither could yet comprehend how completely this single night would alter the course of their lives. The first rays of morning sunlight filtered through Aria's gauzy curtains, gently pulling Richard from deep sleep. For a moment, he lay perfectly still, disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings and even more by the unfamiliar sensations coursing through him. Beside him, Aria slept peacefully, her breathing soft and rhythmic. Looking at her, Richard felt something shift within his chest, a warmth that spread outward, melting frozen parts of himself he hadn't even realized were ice. The feeling was overwhelming, powerful. Careful not to disturb her, Richard slipped from the bed. His movements were measured and silent as he gathered his clothes, each piece of his CEO armor reassembling his public identity with every button fastened. At her small desk, he found a notepad adorned with children's doodles. He hesitated, pen hovering over paper. What could he possibly write that would make sense of last night, of the walls that had fallen, the truths shared, the connection formed? Fear gripped him. Not of Aria, but of what she represented, vulnerability, emotion, the loss of the control that had defined his existence. His defenses, built over decades, reasserted themselves with crushing force. The pen moved decisively across paper. Thank you for an unexpected evening. I've called a car service for your use today. Ah. Cold. Impersonal. Safe. He placed the note on her kitchen counter, along with enough cash to cover a week of car services, and quietly let himself out. Richard's penthouse greeted him with pristine silence. Everything remained exactly as he had left it, untouched, perfect, sterile. He showered and changed into a fresh suit, his morning routine executed with military precision. At his home office desk, he opened his laptop to review the Asian markets and prepare for his 9 a.m. conference call. The familiar rhythm of numbers and projections should have centered him, as it had countless mornings before. Instead, the figures blurred before his eyes. He read the same paragraph 3 times without comprehension. His mind kept drifting back to Aria's apartment, to her laugh, her challenging questions, the way she had seen through his carefully constructed facade. Richard Barrett, who had built an empire through relentless focus and discipline, couldn't concentrate on a simple quarterly report. For the first time in his career, the work that had defined his existence failed to command his full attention. Coffee in hand, Richard stood up to his floor-to-ceiling windows, gazing at the city below without truly seeing it. Aria's words played on repeat in his mind. What good is an empire if you're alone in it? Pain can make you bitter, or it can make you more compassionate. I see you. Just you. He couldn't remember the last time someone's thoughts had lingered with him this way. Business adversaries, board members, even Catherine, their words had been analyzed, countered, and dismissed with efficient precision. But Aria's voice refused to be silenced by his usual defenses, her insights penetrating the armor he had worn for so long. By mid-morning, Richard had made his way to the office, hoping the familiar environment would restore his focus. Instead, the change in his demeanor became increasingly apparent to those around him. Mr. Barrett? Vanessa's voice broke through his thoughts for the 3rd time. The Tokyo team is waiting for your decision on the merger terms. Right. He scanned the document before him. Tell them I need until tomorrow. Vanessa blinked in surprise. Richard Barrett never delayed decisions. Later, when a junior analyst presented flawed projections, the staff braced for the cutting dismissal that typically followed such mistakes. Instead, Richard merely said, recalculate these figures and explain your methodology when you resubmit. No ice in his tone. No public humiliation. As she placed fresh coffee on his desk, Vanessa studied her boss with careful discretion. Something had changed overnight. The razor-sharp focus had softened, the glacial demeanor had warmed by degrees that were subtle to others but glaring to someone who had worked alongside him for years. By afternoon, Richard attempted his tried-and-true method for handling any personal disruption, complete immersion in work. He scheduled back-to-back meetings, reviewed acquisition proposals, and demanded immediate updates on all ongoing projects. Yet even as he moved through his professional responsibilities with outward competence, Aria remained a constant presence in his thoughts. During a critical budget meeting, he found himself wondering what she would think of their allocation of resources. While reviewing architectural plans for a new development, he remembered her comment about spaces that nurtured human connection rather than just efficiency. He worked through lunch, through his usual coffee break, pushing himself with the discipline that had built his empire. But for the first time, work failed to provide its usual escape. The emails, meetings, and decisions that had always consumed his complete attention now felt hollow, as if some essential meaning had gone missing. The harder he fought against thoughts of Aria, the more persistently they returned. As the workday neared its end, a startling realization hit Richard. Despite the intimacy they had shared, he possessed almost no practical information about Aria. No phone number. No email address. Not even her full name. He knew she was an art therapist who worked with traumatized children. He knew she lived in a pre-war building in Brooklyn with colorful walls and mismatched furniture. He knew the depth of her compassion and the warmth of her laugh. But none of this information would help him find her through conventional means. For a man accustomed to commanding vast resources and information networks, this sudden helplessness was both foreign and frustrating. With a few keystrokes, he could access financial data on any major corporation, yet he couldn't send a simple message to the woman who had somehow broken through decades of carefully maintained barriers. The irony wasn't lost on him. The most powerful connection he'd ever experienced came with no means of reconnection. At day's end, Richard dismissed his driver, instructed his security team to be in casual outfits, then they walked the 20 blocks to his penthouse, hoping physical exertion might clear his mind. The city bustled around him, but he remained lost in internal struggle. For 3 decades, he had built his identity on being untouchable, emotionally invulnerable, ruthlessly focused, perfectly controlled. That identity had forged his success, protected him from hurt, justified his isolation. Now, in the span of a single night, those foundations had begun to crack. Emotions he had long suppressed demanded recognition. Questions he had never allowed himself to consider suddenly required answers. Who was he if not the Ice King? What would remain if he allowed these walls to fall completely? Could he function as effectively without the armor he had worn for so long? The uncertainty shook him to his core. He had faced billion-dollar negotiations with unwavering confidence, yet this internal transformation left him profoundly unsettled. Richard Barrett was melting, and nothing in his experience had prepared him for what might emerge. Back at Aria's place, morning light streamed through her bedroom window as she stretched awake, her hand instinctively reaching toward the space beside her. Empty. The sheets had already cooled. The events of the previous night flooded back, their conversation, their connection, the walls that had momentarily fallen between them. For a brief moment, she had glimpsed the man behind the ruthless reputation, and he had seemed so genuinely present. In her kitchen, she found his note. The handwriting was precise, controlled, just like him. No warmth, no acknowledgement of what had passed between them. Just a cool thank you and money for transportation. Aria sighed, disappointed but not surprised. Men like Richard Barrett didn't change overnight. The vulnerability he had shown had probably terrified him by morning light. She placed the cash in an envelope, marking it for her art program's supply fund. At least something good could come from his retreat into coldness. Over breakfast, Aria's phone lit up with a text from Zoe, details. Now. Did the Ice King melt? Aria hesitated, then replied simply, he's exactly who everyone says he is. Moving on. She refused to dwell on her disappointment or to romanticize what had happened. She wouldn't become another conquest story, another woman who mistook physical intimacy for something more meaningful from a powerful man. Richard had shown her glimpses of authenticity, yes. But by morning, his walls had reconstructed themselves. She had seen this pattern before with other guarded people. Standing under the shower, Aria made a firm decision. She wouldn't waste emotional energy on a man who couldn't even leave a warm goodbye. The connection she'd felt had clearly been one-sided, a momentary lapse in his carefully maintained facade. Her children at the art therapy center needed her full attention and energy. They deserved better than a distracted therapist nursing romantic disappointment. For 7 days, Aria buried herself in her work with fierce determination. She extended her hours at the center, added 3 new children to her already full caseload, and volunteered for weekend community art projects. Every moment filled meant one less moment to think about steel-gray eyes that had softened in the moonlight, or conversations that had felt more genuine than any she'd had in years. She developed a new therapy technique using clay reconstruction for children dealing with trauma, watching with satisfaction as her young clients responded positively. She reorganized the supply closet, repainted the center's waiting area, and wrote a grant proposal that had been sitting on her to-do list for months. At night, exhaustion should have brought dreamless sleep. Instead, her mind would drift inevitably to that evening, to the man who had briefly dropped his armor and shown her something real beneath the cold exterior. The harder she worked to forget, the more persistent the memories became. On the 8th day after the gala, Aria returned home to find an official envelope taped to her door. Inside was the final eviction notice she had been dreading: 14 days to vacate or pay the 3 months of back rent plus the new increased amount. She sank onto her couch, the weight of her financial reality crushing the professional momentum she had built over the past week. The numbers were impossible. Even if she took on more coffee shop shifts and cancelled her health insurance, the math simply didn't work. Calls to friends about temporary housing turned up no viable options. Her credit score made new apartment applications futile. The private practice job offer had already been filled. For all her determination and hard work, Aria faced the prospect of losing the home that had been her sanctuary, the place where children's artwork covered the walls and her mother's quilt draped across the bed. The unfairness of it all brought tears she had been refusing to shed. The following morning, Dr. Reynolds, the hospital administrator who oversaw the children's therapy programs, called Aria into his office. His typically serious expression had been replaced by something resembling amazement. "Aria, something extraordinary has happened," he began, motioning for her to sit. "An anonymous donor has contributed $500,000 specifically earmarked for your art therapy program." She stared at him in disbelief. "The funds are designated for expanded space, supplies," and he paused, checking his notes, "a full-time salary with benefits for you, rather than your current part-time status." He slid a document across his desk. "The donor specified that you should have complete creative control over program development." Aria looked down at the paperwork, her mind racing. This amount would transform her program, allowing her to help triple the number of children. It would also solve her personal financial crisis instantly. But something about the timing felt far from coincidental. Walking home, Aria's emotions battled within her. Only one person she had recently met possessed both the resources and knowledge of her work to make such a specific donation: Richard Barrett. Part of her felt immense gratitude. The gift would help dozens of traumatized children who desperately needed support. It would secure her program's future and solve her housing crisis. Yet another part felt uncomfortable. Was this his way of paying for their night together? A wealthy man's method of clearing his conscience? Or worse, was he attempting to buy her affection after his cold departure? She stopped at a small park, sitting on a bench to sort through her conflicting feelings. The donation came without conditions, no naming rights, no public recognition, no demands for her time or attention. If his motivation was genuine concern for her work, that revealed something meaningful about the man behind the reputation. If it was manipulation, she wanted no part of it. "It has to be him," Zoe said that evening over wine in Aria's apartment. "The timing, the amount, the specificity about your control of the program, it's too perfect to be coincidence." "But why?" Aria pressed. "He left without a proper goodbye. Now this grand gesture with no follow-up?" Zoe twirled her wine glass thoughtfully. "Maybe he doesn't know how to bridge these worlds. Men like Barrett don't exactly have practice with normal human connections." "So I should what?" Thank him for possibly buying my affection? Or, Zoe suggested carefully, consider that maybe, just maybe, he actually cares about your work. That perhaps something you said got through to him. Even if that's true, he chose to leave rather than explore whatever connection we had. True. But this donation speaks louder than his note. Zoe leaned forward. The Richard Barrett I've read about doesn't make anonymous charitable donations without strategic benefit. This is different. My dear family, what would you do if you were in Aria's position? Would you, just like her, try to forget about Richard and move forward independently, or would you reach out to him to discover the truth behind his donation? I'm so curious about your thoughts on this situation, someone's actions contradicting their cold goodbye. Let me know your advice for Aria in the comments below. I read each one and cherish your insights. By the way, if you're enjoying this story, don't enjoy it alone. Take a moment to share it with 5 friends you love. Spreading these tales of transformation is how our family continues to grow together. Let's continue. The truth is, 2 days after their night together, Richard had called his head of security to his office. I need information on an art therapist named Aria Mitchell. Works with traumatized children, likely at a hospital or community center in Brooklyn. Within hours, a comprehensive file appeared on his desk. Aria Mitchell, 27. Master's degree in art therapy from NYU, graduated with honors despite working 2 jobs. Currently employed part-time at Manhattan Children's Hospital's outpatient center, specializing in trauma recovery through artistic expression. The financial details made him frown. 3 months behind on rent for an apartment with an impending significant increase. Student loan payments in forbearance. Credit cards nearly maxed out, primarily with purchases from art supply stores. Most revealing was a letter of rejection. She had declined a position at an upscale private practice offering triple her current salary, choosing instead to continue her work with underprivileged children who had experienced trauma. Her principles, it seemed, extended far beyond their conversation. Richard's initial impulse was straightforward: solve the problem with resources. A single phone call to his foundation director and $500,000 were transferred to Manhattan Children's Hospital, specifically designated for Aria's art therapy program. The donation must remain anonymous, he instructed, and ensure the therapist has complete creative control. As he hung up, a strange emptiness followed what should have been satisfaction. Money had always been his solution, his language for fixing problems, asserting control, demonstrating power. But Aria's words from their night together returned to him: some things can't be bought or negotiated, Richard. Real connection doesn't have a price tag. He realized his donation, while genuinely intended to help her work, was also the action of a man who knew no other way to reach out. It was meaningful, but insufficient, a financial transaction that couldn't bridge the emotional gap his abrupt departure had created. Money wouldn't be enough. Not with her. 3 days later, Richard entered the children's hospital wearing not his usual tailored suit, but simple dark slacks and a gray cashmere sweater. He had dismissed his driver, arrived without entourage, and waited patiently in line at the information desk like any ordinary visitor. When directed to the art therapy center on the 3rd floor, he found a modest space filled with color, walls covered with children's artwork, tables stocked with supplies, and in the center of it all, Aria guiding a young boy through a painting exercise. She froze when she noticed him in the doorway. "Mr. Barrett," she said, professional but cool. "This is unexpected." "I was hoping to learn more about your program," he replied, his usual commanding tone softened. if you have time. Her expression remained guarded. May I ask why? Because I've never seen anything quite like it, he answered with uncharacteristic honesty. And I'd like to understand. Was the donation from you? Aria asked directly once her young client had been picked up by his mother. Richard met her gaze. Yes. Why? Your program deserves funding. Aria crossed her arms. And showing up here today? Is this to ensure your investment is being managed properly? No, Richard replied. This is personal curiosity. Her expression softened slightly, though suspicion remained in her eyes. I have a group session for children in 10 minutes. You can observe from that chair in the corner, but no interruptions, no phone calls, no leaving mid-session. Understood. And Richard, she added, using his first name deliberately, these children have experienced enough abandonment. If you're here for some kind of personal redemption or to clear your conscience about our night together, find another project. Her directness both surprised and impressed him. I'm here to learn, he said simply. Nothing more. Aria nodded, still uncertain, but willing to give him this chance. From his corner chair, Richard observed as 4 children aged 6 to 9 entered the room. Their bodies told stories before they spoke, shoulders hunched protectively, eyes darting to assess threats, fingers fidgeting with nervous energy. These were children who had seen too much of life's harshness too soon. Yet as Aria greeted each by name, subtle transformations occurred. A boy's tight posture loosened. A girl's downcast eyes lifted. The atmosphere in the room shifted from caution to tentative safety. Today we're creating safe places, Aria explained, setting out clay, paints, and various materials. Your safe place can be real or made up, somewhere that exists now or somewhere you wish existed. Richard watched her move among them, her interactions perfectly calibrated to each child's needs. For the withdrawn girl, gentle encouragement without pressure. For the angry boy, clear boundaries coupled with respect for his expressions. When a small dark-haired boy began crying in frustration, Aria knelt beside him. The clay isn't doing what you want, she asked softly. The boy nodded. Sometimes the most beautiful things come from mistakes, she said. Let's see what this shape wants to become instead. Something tightened in Richard's chest as he witnessed healing happening through such simple, profound human connection. After the session, Richard drove alone through Manhattan's busy streets, his mind replaying what he had witnessed. For decades, he had measured value in market share, profit margins, and asset accumulation. Success meant defeating competitors, maximizing shareholder returns, and expanding his empire. Yet in that small, modestly furnished art room, he had observed a different kind of value creation, one that couldn't be quantified on balance sheets. With minimal resources, Aria created profound impact. Each child left visibly transformed from when they arrived, standing taller, breathing easier, carrying hope where there had been none. Richard thought of his recent acquisition, a struggling community hospital chain now streamlined for efficiency, with arts programs among the first budget items eliminated. He thought of employee wellness initiatives rejected as unnecessary expenses, despite research showing their benefits. He thought of his company motto, maximum return, minimum investment. For the first time in his career, Richard Barrett questioned not just his methods, but the fundamental values driving his business decisions. Richard, we need to discuss your recent decisions, Marcus Donovan said, closing the boardroom door behind the remaining members after their weekly meeting. Victoria and Benjamin exchanged glances as Marcus continued, "You've cancelled the Henderson Hospital cuts, doubled the Employee Education Fund, and rejected the offshore tax strategy we've spent months developing." "Those decisions are sound," Richard replied calmly. "They're unprecedented," Victoria countered. "And concerning." Benjamin cleared his throat. "There are also the unexplained absences. 3 afternoons last week you were unreachable." "We're worried you're distracted," Marcus said carefully. "The Williams merger needs your full attention. Billions are at stake." "Is this about a woman?" Victoria asked directly. "The staff has noticed changes since the hospital gala." Richard's face remained impassive, though something flashed in his eyes, a warning that would have once silenced such questioning immediately. "My focus on the company has never been sharper," he said. "But perhaps what the company needs has changed." Later, alone in his office, Richard reviewed the board's concerns with surprising detachment. Throughout his career, their approval had been essential, their warnings heeded without question. The company had always come first, its growth the central purpose of his existence. Now, he found himself unmoved by their anxieties. He pulled up the redesign plans for the newly acquired Children's Hospital wing, the project he had personally taken over, insisting on art therapy spaces in every department. The additional cost was significant, the ROI impossible to calculate in traditional terms. Yet when he thought of the children he had observed in Aria's session, their transformation from broken to hopeful, the numbers seemed irrelevant compared to the human impact. For the first time in his adult life, Richard Barrett had found something that mattered more than business metrics, market dominance, or board approval. He had discovered a different kind of value, one that couldn't be measured in dollars but in human connection and genuine purpose. The realization was both liberating and terrifying. Within weeks, changes began rippling through Barrett Enterprises. Small adjustments at first, an expanded parental leave policy, wellness programs in all office locations, flexible work arrangements for employees with family needs. The executive team received new directives. Community impact would now be considered alongside profit margins in all project evaluations. Environmental sustainability became a required element in development plans. The employee handbook was rewritten to emphasize collaboration over competition, human dignity over ruthless efficiency. None of these changes were announced with fanfare or publicity. They simply appeared as new company policies, implemented with the same decisive efficiency that had always characterized Richard Barrett's leadership style. But the inspiration behind them was unmistakably new. Richard allocated $50 million to establish the Barrett Creative Healing Foundation, an organization dedicated to bringing arts therapy programs to underprivileged communities nationwide. The foundation would fund art spaces in hospitals, schools, and community centers serving children affected by trauma, poverty, and neglect. Unlike his other business ventures, Richard involved himself personally in the foundation's development. He hired a team of experts in childhood development and arts education, giving them autonomy to design programs based on effectiveness rather than cost efficiency. In board meetings to structure the foundation, Richard spoke with unusual passion about the transformative power of creative expression for children who had experienced trauma. When questioned about the substantial financial commitment, he simply stated, "Some investments yield returns that can't be quantified on balance sheets." The foundation's mission statement, written by Richard himself, reflected a philosophy entirely new to his business approach: every child deserves access to healing through creative expression, regardless of economic circumstance. As Richard continued visiting the Art Therapy Center, Aria's initial skepticism gradually softened. She watched him engage with her program not as a wealthy donor expecting recognition, but as someone genuinely invested in understanding the work. When newspapers reported Barrett Enterprises' new workplace policies, she recognized concepts from their conversation subtly woven into corporate practice. When the foundation was announced without fanfare or Richard's name prominently featured, she noted how different this was from typical billionaire philanthropy. Most revealing were his interactions with hospital staff. He remembered names, listened attentively to concerns from custodians and administrators alike, and followed through on suggestions for facility improvements. The feared Ice King of business media bore little resemblance to the man who now regularly appeared at her sessions, sitting quietly in the corner, observing with genuine interest rather than calculation. "You're not who I thought you were," Aria admitted one afternoon as they walked through the hospital garden. "I'm not who I thought I was either," Richard replied softly. During his 5th visit to the center, Aria was called away for an urgent consultation, leaving Richard alone with 8-year-old Noah, her most withdrawn patient who hadn't spoken in months following his parents' death in a car accident. The boy sat motionless at the table, staring at blank paper. After a moment of hesitation, Richard sat beside him. "I used to be afraid of blank pages too," he said quietly, selecting a pencil. "Still am, sometimes." He began sketching simple geometric shapes, squares becoming buildings, circles becoming windows. "When I was about your age, I felt alone too," Richard continued, his voice gentle. Drawing helped when words wouldn't come. Slowly, Noah picked up a blue crayon and added a small figure to Richard's cityscape. "Is that you?" Richard asked. The boy nodded, his first responsive communication in weeks. When Aria returned, she found them working side by side in comfortable silence, the paper between them filling with shared creation, leaving her amazed by the transformation. Over coffee after sessions, their conversations resumed the depth and honesty of their first night together. Richard shared his evolving business philosophy while Aria offered insights from her therapeutic approach. Their intellectual connection strengthened, complemented now by growing mutual respect. "The children respond to you," she acknowledged one evening as they walked through a small park near the hospital. "Noah especially. They respond to authenticity," Richard replied. "Something I'm still learning." When his hand briefly touched hers, the familiar electricity returned. Yet Aria maintained a careful distance, uncertain whether his transformation would endure once the novelty faded. "You've changed," she said, studying his face in the fading light. "Because of you." She shook her head. "Change that depends on another person isn't sustainable. I need to know who you are when the influence fades, when business pressures return, when the initial inspiration becomes routine." "That's fair," he conceded, respecting her caution rather than pushing for more. Victor Blackwood, CEO of Meridian Global and Richard's long-standing business rival, requested a private meeting at his downtown office. The invitation itself was unusual. Their interactions typically occurred only in courtrooms or through attorneys. "Your recent corporate decisions have been fascinating to observe," Blackwood said, gesturing toward a Wall Street Journal article about Barrett Enterprises' policy changes. Quite the departure from the Richard Barrett who once said compassion has no place in competitive markets. Richard remained silent, watching the man who had tried to acquire his company 3 times in the past decade. "The board's concerns about your leadership have reached interested parties," Blackwood continued. "I have copies of internal memos questioning your focus, your judgment, your commitment to shareholder value." He slid a folder across his desk. "Your stock has dropped 8%. Key investors are nervous." My offer to acquire Barrett Enterprises still stands at 15% above current market value. Blackwood leaned forward. Or I release these documents to the financial press, highlighting how the fearsome Ice King has melted into sentimentality, prioritizing children's art programs over profit margins. Your choice. The threat hung between them, not just to Richard's company, but to the very changes he had begun implementing. The programs, the foundation, all of it could disappear under Blackwood's leadership. 6 months earlier, Richard would have responded to such a threat with cold, calculated destruction. He possessed enough confidential information on Blackwood's questionable business practices to trigger federal investigations. He had cultivated relationships with key board members at Meridian Global who owed him favors. With 3 phone calls, he could have initiated a counter-takeover that would leave Blackwood professionally ruined. The old Richard Barrett had built his empire by eliminating threats without mercy or hesitation. Compassion was weakness, retribution was simply good business. Competitors who challenged him directly rarely remained standing long enough to attempt it twice. The path of destruction lay open before him, familiar and effective. Richard studied Blackwood's satisfied expression, a man certain he had cornered his prey. The familiar cold calculation rose within him, the instinct to destroy rather than negotiate. Then he thought of Noah's tentative crayon marks alongside his own. Of Aria's belief that people could change without losing their core strength. You're right about one thing, Victor, Richard said, standing. I have changed. But not in the way you think. He left the folder untouched. Release whatever you want. Then prepare yourself, because Barrett Enterprises will demonstrate that ethical leadership and financial success aren't mutually exclusive. The market will destroy you, Blackwood warned. Perhaps. But I'd rather fail building something meaningful than succeed creating nothing of value. He moved toward the door. And Victor? Unlike before, I won't fight dirty. But I will fight smart. Don't mistake new principles for weakness. Richard walked out, already formulating a strategy that honored both his business acumen and his evolving humanity. The Barrett Enterprises boardroom hummed with tension as Richard entered. Usually, he would have been first to arrive, setting the tone. Today, the board members were already assembled, documents arranged before them like weapons. Marcus Donovan spoke first. We've called this emergency session in light of recent developments. Victor Blackwood has made his intentions public, his positioning for a hostile takeover. Victoria placed a tablet in front of Richard. The screen displayed financial news headlines. Barrett Enterprises stock falls 12% amid leadership concerns. Has the Ice King lost his edge? Investors question Barrett's new direction. Meridian Global poised to acquire Barrett Empire as values shift alienates Wall Street. Benjamin slid a formal letter across the table. We have a motion from major shareholders calling for your temporary removal as CEO until this crisis is resolved. Richard scanned the familiar names, investors who had profited enormously from his cutthroat strategies over the years. Your recent decisions have created vulnerability, Marcus continued. The new policies, the foundation, the rejected acquisition opportunities, they've been interpreted as weakness. The board has always trusted your judgment, Victoria added, her tone softer. But we need to understand if your priorities remain aligned with the company's best interests. Richard met each gaze steadily, recognizing the crossroads before him. That evening, Richard found himself at Aria's apartment, pacing between her colorful walls as he explained the board's ultimatum. They want me to revert to old methods, he said, frustration evident in his voice. Abandon the changes, focus exclusively on share price, use aggressive tactics against Blackwood. Aria listened thoughtfully, then asked, "What do you want?" "To protect what I've built." "But what is it you've truly built, Richard? A company that makes money or something more meaningful?" She approached him, her eyes meeting his directly. "Your strength never came from coldness. It came from clarity, vision, and determination. Those qualities haven't vanished, they've found new purpose." "The business world doesn't reward purpose over profit," he countered. "Then change the rules," she challenged. "You transformed yourself without losing your core strength. Why can't you transform your company the same way?" Her faith in him, clear-eyed yet unwavering, steadied his resolve for the battle ahead. The next morning, Richard entered the boardroom with the same commanding presence that had defined his leadership for years. For 2 decades, he began, Barrett Enterprises has measured success through one lens: maximum profit at minimum cost. That approach built our fortune, but at a price we rarely acknowledged. He moved to the head of the table, standing tall. "The world is changing. Consumers support companies that reflect their values. Talented employees choose workplaces with purpose beyond profit. Sustainability isn't charity, it's survival." Richard displayed new financial projections on the screen. "These numbers represent our current course, maintaining our ethical initiatives while strengthening our market position. Our foundation isn't just philanthropy, it's research and development for future markets. Our employee policies aren't expenses, they're investments in retention and innovation." His voice grew stronger, more passionate than the board had ever witnessed. "I built this company to last beyond quarterly reports. If Blackwood wants to acquire us, he'll face not just our financial strength, but the loyalty of employees and consumers who believe in what we're becoming." He surveyed the room, meeting each gaze directly. "I won't revert to old methods that mortgage our future for short-term gains. Barrett Enterprises can be profitable and principled. That's not weakness, it's evolution. And those who won't evolve will be left behind." Silence followed Richard's declaration. Then Harrison Wells, the oldest board member, stood up. "I've been with this company for 30 years. This isn't the Barrett Enterprises I signed on for." He placed his resignation letter on the table. "I wish you luck, Richard, but I cannot follow this path." 2 other members followed suit, gathering their materials without meeting Richard's eyes. As they departed, Victoria remained seated, a thoughtful expression on her face. "I've never heard you speak with such conviction," she said. "It's refreshing." Marcus, who had raised the initial concerns, tapped his fingers on the table. "Risky. Unconventional." He paused. "But potentially revolutionary if it works." Benjamin nodded slowly. "My daughter actually mentioned your foundation's first art therapy center. She called it the future of corporate responsibility." A new energy filled the room, tentative but genuine excitement replacing the earlier tension. "So," Richard asked, "who's staying to build this future with me?" At the press conference announcing Barrett Enterprises' strategic realignment, journalists peppered Richard with questions about his apparent transformation from ruthless CEO to ethical business leader. "What prompted this evolution in your business philosophy?" asked a reporter from Financial Times. Richard, dressed in his customary impeccable suit but with a new warmth in his expression, considered the question carefully. "Sometimes we need someone to help us see beyond our self-imposed limitations," he answered. I've been fortunate to meet an extraordinary art therapist who showed me the profound impact of compassionate, principled work. He spoke Aria's name with respect, crediting her program's approach to healing traumatized children as the catalyst for his rethinking of corporate purpose. She demonstrated that true strength isn't found in domination but in creating genuine value and connection. Her work with limited resources achieves outcomes that billions in corporate assets never could. That revelation changed not just my business perspective, but my understanding of what constitutes meaningful success. Financial media exploded with analysis of Richard Barrett's stunning evolution. Business channels featured round-the-clock discussions debating whether this represented brilliant strategy or career suicide. Barrett redefines corporate leadership, declared the Wall Street Journal, while Bloomberg ran with Ice King Thors, will Barrett's warmth freeze profits? Harvard Business Review rushed a special edition examining the potential long-term impacts of Barrett's approach. Former rivals offered conflicting opinions, some dismissing it as a temporary aberration, others watching with cautious interest. Young entrepreneurs and business students, however, embraced Richard's new philosophy enthusiastically. Applications to work at Barrett Enterprises tripled, while ethics professors incorporated his press conference into their curricula. The term Barrett Method began appearing in business forums, describing the integration of profit motive with social responsibility. For a man who had spent decades cultivating a reputation for cold calculation, becoming a symbol of ethical transformation created a strange new type of influence, one that couldn't be measured in market share but in shifted perspectives across the industry. Watching from the audience as Richard fielded hostile questions from financial analysts, Aria felt a profound shift in her perception of him. This wasn't performance or strategy, it was authentic conviction. The man standing before the world's scrutiny wasn't using his resources to impress her or purchase redemption. He was risking his life's work, his reputation, his fortune, all to honor principles he had come to believe in deeply. No one could fake that level of commitment. No temporary infatuation would justify such professional risk. The walls around her heart, built from caution and past disappointments, began to soften. Richard's transformation wasn't about her at all, it was genuinely about him becoming whole. In the weeks that followed, as Barrett Enterprises weathered market volatility and media scrutiny, Richard and Aria found their connection deepening through shared purpose rather than mere attraction. She accompanied him to foundation openings, offering professional guidance on program development. He attended her therapy sessions regularly, learning techniques to incorporate into corporate wellness initiatives. Their conversations expanded beyond personal discovery to shared vision, how businesses could embrace human values without sacrificing viability, how art therapy principles could transform corporate culture. "I never expected to help reshape a multinational corporation," Aria admitted one evening as they reviewed plans for a new community center. "I never expected to find meaning beyond the bottom line," Richard replied, his hand finding hers across the table. The initial chemistry between them had evolved into something more substantial, a partnership built on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine care for each other's worlds. What had begun as an unlikely encounter between opposites had transformed into a balanced relationship where both were becoming their best selves together. 6 months after Richard's bold declaration, Barrett Enterprises' quarterly report revealed surprising results. Despite predictions of financial collapse from critics, profits remained stable while employee retention had increased by 20%. The company's new ethical framework had attracted partners previously hesitant to associate with Barrett's cutthroat reputation. 3 major sustainable energy projects had been secured, positioning the company advantageously in emerging markets. Most telling was the shift in corporate culture. Offices once defined by competitive tension now fostered collaborative innovation. The wellness programs and family-friendly policies had reduced sick days and increased productivity. When the Wall Street Journal published its annual leadership assessment, Richard Barrett was featured on the cover, not as the feared Ice King, but as the architect of compassionate capitalism, a model being cautiously adopted by forward-thinking corporations worldwide. Victor Blackwood's attempted hostile takeover had faded into a footnote, his outdated strategies no match for Richard's authentic vision and the loyalty it inspired in both employees and customers. The Barrett Creative Healing Foundation had flourished under Aria's professional guidance and Richard's business acumen. What began as a single program had expanded to 37 centers across 15 states, each designed with input from both children and therapists. Aria now led a team of specialists developing standardized training while preserving the individualized approach that made her program effective. Her methods had been documented in a professional journal, bringing academic recognition to work previously considered alternative. Richard contributed his strategic vision and connections, removing bureaucratic obstacles that typically hindered nonprofit expansion. Their complementary strengths created an organization that maintained heart while achieving scale. Most meaningful were their site visits, traveling together to communities where children had limited access to mental health services. Watching Aria train local therapists while he handled logistics, Richard found a fulfillment that no business acquisition had ever provided. Their professional partnership had become as seamless as their personal connection, each enhancing the other's natural gifts. On the anniversary of their first meeting, Richard stood at the window of his office, watching the sunset paint the city gold. His reflection had softened over the past year, the hard lines of perpetual tension replaced by the quiet confidence of a man at peace with himself. He thought back to that rainy night, to champagne spilled on an expensive suit, to a woman who had met his cold stare without flinching. What had transformed him wasn't the physical passion they'd shared, though that connection remained powerful. It was the simple, profound experience of being truly seen, not as a billionaire, not as the feared business titan, but as the man beneath those labels. In his world of strategic relationships and calculated interactions, Aria had offered something revolutionary, authentic connection without agenda. She had somehow recognized the wounded boy behind the powerful man, acknowledging his strength while challenging his isolation. She hadn't tried to tear down his walls, she had simply shown him that he was missing the view beyond them. That night, something long dormant had awakened. Not just desire, but curiosity about a different way of existing in the world. A way that integrated purpose with profit, strength with compassion, success with meaning. One night of genuine connection had altered his understanding of what truly mattered. The indicators on Richard's desk had changed. Where once he tracked only stock prices and market share, now additional metrics held equal prominence: employee satisfaction scores, community impact assessments, sustainability benchmarks. Success was no longer measured solely in dollars, but in human terms: how many children received therapy, how many employees could truly balance work and family, how many communities benefited from conscientious development. The quarterly reports still mattered, but alongside them stood handwritten notes from program participants, artwork from children in the foundation centers, and photographs from community projects. The ruthless pursuit of wealth had transformed into something richer, the creation of value that extended beyond balance sheets into human lives. What Aria understood, what made her influence so profound, was that she never asked Richard to abandon his strengths. She simply helped him redirect them toward more meaningful ends. His strategic brilliance now served vulnerable communities rather than just shareholders. His attention to detail ensured therapy programs maintained excellence while scaling nationwide. His negotiation skills secured partnerships with hospitals that previously couldn't afford mental health services. You never wanted me to be less powerful, he remarked to her one evening. Just more purposeful. Aria smiled. Strength isn't the problem. It's how we use it. She had recognized that Richard's capabilities were extraordinary, his focus, his vision, his determination. Those qualities hadn't diminished as his compassion grew. If anything, they had become more refined, more effective when aligned with genuine purpose. The world still saw a powerful CEO. The difference was that now his power created healing rather than merely wealth, connection rather than competition. On a Wednesday afternoon, Richard asked Aria to meet him at the original Art Therapy Center, claiming they needed to review renovation plans. When she arrived, she found the space transformed. Soft lighting illuminated the walls where hundreds of children's artwork had been carefully arranged in a thoughtful display. Each piece represented a milestone in their journey: the blue cityscape Noah had created with Richard, the gold-mended pottery from Lily's breakthrough, colorful expressions from children at each of their nationwide centers. Richard stood in the center of the room, no longer the intimidating figure in an expensive suit, but a man whose eyes reflected genuine emotion. "This is where I truly began to live," he said softly. "Where I learned that success without meaning is no success at all." He took her hands in his. "You didn't try to change me. You simply showed me a better version of myself was possible." From his pocket, he withdrew not a flashy diamond, but a simple ring with a small piece of gold-veined blue stone, reminiscent of their kintsugi pottery lesson about beauty in broken places. "Will you continue this journey with me?" he asked, his voice steady yet vulnerable. "Building something meaningful together, as partners in every sense?" Tears filled Aria's eyes as she nodded, the children's artwork witnessing their embrace. "Aria, what if you hadn't listened to me when I asked that you attend that gala with me, huh?" Zoe teased, refilling their wine glasses in Aria's apartment, now filled with both her artwork and touches of Richard's presence, books, a cashmere throw, framed photographs of their center openings. Aria laughed, the engagement ring catching light as she reached for her glass. "I would have been less stressed that evening, that's for sure. And considerably less engaged right now," Zoe pointed out with a smirk. "Just think, all because you spilled champagne on the most intimidating man in Manhattan. All because you insisted I needed a proper food that wasn't microwaved," Aria corrected, nudging her friend affectionately. Zoe's expression softened. "Seeing you both today at the center opening. I've never seen two people more perfectly matched. The kids adore him almost as much as they adore you. Who would have thought? The Ice King and the art therapist." "Speaking of perfect matches," Zoe said, her eyes gleaming with excitement, "I have wedding ideas. Lots of them. The magazine's event team owes me favors." Aria groaned playfully. "Let me guess, fashion closet dresses and society photographers." "Only the best for my best friend," Zoe declared grandly, making them both dissolve into laughter. "And so, my beautiful family, as we conclude today's story, may we all have the courage to let love transform us, to see past the walls others build, and to recognize that true strength comes from connection, not isolation. May we find the wisdom to look beyond appearances, beyond wealth, beyond status, to the authentic hearts beating within each person we meet. Like Aria and Richard, may we discover that our greatest purpose often reveals itself through unexpected encounters, and that our most profound growth comes when we dare to be fully seen. May divine love continue to guide your paths, heal your wounds, and open your hearts to life's beautiful possibilities. Amen. My precious family, thank you for sharing this journey with me today. Your presence here means more than you know, and I treasure each moment we spend together through these stories. Before you go, please take a moment to like this video if it touched your heart, subscribe if you haven't already joined our family, and share it with someone who might need this message of transformation and hope. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What part of Richard and Aria's journey resonated most with you? Remember, you are deeply loved, cherished, and never alone. Until our next story, bye.